Hello everyone, today we talk about the actual strength of the Mongolian armies, say between the 12th and the 14th century. Actually, it's a huge topic because if we were to focus on the single, say, country's organization managed by the Mongols throughout Eurasia, of course, we would be more precise. And this is something we're going to do at some other point because we will observe, say, the army organization of China or Persia, etc. Actually, I think I made one about the Ilkhanate specifically. So looking at the Mongol armies throughout the various regional pools that at the end of the day would become the main base of recruitment and of properly numerical strength as far as the local participation to the Mongol army was concerned. And in fact, that's actually the most fascinating, as obscure dynamic by a degree. That is to say, the early Mongol armies are just like this thing coming out from nowhere, right, without an actual ethnic documentation from Mongolia, and of course being described in quite particular ways, not just because, say, again, there was a bit of sensationalism about Mongol armies. This is not wrong, right? We're talking about one of the strongest armies in history, but as we have seen many times in this, say, in this video, is not just about actual strength. We made really a few, mostly I think just about the English armies of the 100 Years' War, but we will come back on this. And we realize, of course, that the odds were often much more balanced than we think overall. Say there is a disclosural historiography that tends to give you the big numbers without even telling you actually what, say, from where, for example, this number come from which type of literature, and so on. Any of these literature I've ever found, the explanation of how, say, for example, different the Arab and the European say properly historiographies really were, right, in terms of critical skill, say rational inclination, like there is, you can't quite read a number and pretend that it's extrapolated from the type of text you're reading. It doesn't even mean in general that being precise about the number was that important, right? It was sometimes more important to give a larger number. This is typical, for example, of the East, a rounded, say, a clean and bigger one sometimes to make the hyperbole, right, work. Say, oh my god, this army was so big that were, I don't know, 700,000 troops, like the ones that we find enumerated or simply counted when Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, right? And it's obvious there that it's an exaggeration. I realize by now, after years of, say, medieval disclosure on the internet, that people have a difficulty to understand not just history in general, but the mere concept that a number is not, say, when a source says something, it's not because it's a source that by itself has any relevance, right? First of all, you come with your own background and you approach this and you say, well, if it's a source, this, so all the people will ask me, what's the source for this? Why don't you post sources? Because I don't have to, first of all. But secondly, even if I gave that to you, and I often do, the say rare response is very often like some sort of incredibly superficial interpretation of, but this author is not this or it's not that, from which you understand that there is nothing about a capacity of critical background regarding that historical datum, on the very basis of course, what is said about this author, this source, whatever. And since I don't have much time to waste in my life, I just proceed by sort of simplifying the process. And if you want to understand well, otherwise I'm not going to spend myself more than much. I'd say what I do dialectically and methodologically in this channel is what must be, right? And I'm in charge here, so if I have a problem with that, which I see the wide majority of my audience doesn't, right, it's not, say, a sign of historical maturity. It's actually one of moral insecurity. And I do not respond to whom doesn't recognize authority as well. Because it's a process, right? It's like rising through the ranks, right? At some point, you cannot afford to ask certain things. Because they're, first of all, not necessary if you understand why I say the things I say on this chat. But this is a bit with history, and it's the reason I say as well, that when you are given this number, just imagine going to the person who wrote this and say, what's your source about that? Why would you think that? It's nonsensical, right? And it's your duty to make your own research and find out, not others to give you baby food so that you can eventually forget the next second because you're just whining for attention. Now, I've made many videos at this point on Mongol warfare, especially last year. I dedicated myself a bit to that. Then other videos had already been made, others came around as a novelty, and we have observed essentially the difficulty, in fact, of say, simplification, of categorization, as far as the Mongols are concerned, in the very ethnic background from which they created the empire, right? And through that, you can understand why we think that most of these numbers, first of all, are an exaggeration. And especially they are not based on data that we can, first of all, verify, but very often also was not really stemming from the same, surely, system of accounting that the Mongols had, and what must have been very sophisticated. And from steppes warfare, there was actually a big deal of decimal system that, of course, was varying according to the practical circumstances. We will see now there weren't, say, squared numbers, in fact, in the way eventually these armies would be recruited or standardized. It was properly such a thing. So we can't easily see that there was an heterogeneity, of course, in the way any army at the time was mobilized, right? The part, at least, of the reason why these numbers are not further documented, right, organically, is from within the same Mongol system, is that all males, essentially, between the ages of 15 and 60, not only were liable for military service, but would normally just be in some sort of active service under their leaders, right? The sense was that no Mongol was completely free, right? It was a concept of liberty for which the loyalty to the leaders, the actual fealty, telling the truth, considering the divine standard at play in Mongol view, and the inescapable nature of the system, because of the ferocious infighting between the various tribes, would bring essentially mobilization to be very speedy, right? Fresh training hardly necessary, because everybody fundamentally already knew what to do, including essentially self-supplying oneself. This was not quite literally the case for the largest Mongol armies, because, of course, the clienteles and hierarchy, etc., were based also on the capacity of the leaders to control more and to provide their troops with more. And naturally, the Mongols had their own sort of development during these centuries. And what is fascinating is that, aside from the fact that naturally, more or less, the Turco-Mongolian steppe remained very traditional, as primitive over time. I will come back on the topic, by the way, but the the rise and fall of the properly Mongol-based military system is something relatively quick, you saw. Right, after all, the Mongols, yes, managed to deter enough across Eurasia to maintain a control from the steppe, from the Mongol Heimat, let's say, as long as they, in fact, conquer, expand, and they eventually overdo in this regard, and the Mongol Empire fragments itself. This is pretty obvious, right? Because as fast as it was not much of another system to keep ruling the regional pools, again, that we've seen before, that had their own political military traditions, and very often also more advanced than the same Mongol ones, at least in sedentary terms, and that, as such, were simply meant to remain where they were, whereas the Mongols would have always had, if they had wanted to maintain the empire from Mongolia, to keep sending troops in the outer world. It was surely also a demographic reason, aside from the more pressing political one, for which this not just wouldn't happen, but couldn't happen. And so Mongolia remained Mongolia, just like, after the Islamic invasion, Arabia fundamentally remained Arabia, and the what we call Mongol in this case lived mostly in the wake of other populations' traditions. Right, of course, that were dramatically, to say the least, influenced by Mongol warfare, but that fundamentally kept resorting on their own modes of war, including organization. And of course, the Mongols were an illiterate society that could afford to do what they did initially, simply because they were that ready, they were that mature in a politically cohesive sense to mobilize this enormous masses of horsemen that would also be, as we will see now, contained. We don't have to think that Mongolia simply emptied itself. Of course, there was a great outpour of these warriors pretty far and wide, as we've seen very often, also affecting the influence in various fighting styles of different areas. But it was also part of a mechanism that had been going on for millennia, and so that the Mongols were just a bit the last true major wave, after which, yes, you had some offspring. If you have the Timurids, you have some powers that inspired themselves to the oceanic rule, right, of Genghis Khan, also by claimed or actual descent and so on. But that expansive capacity witnessed in the late 12th, especially the 13th century, was obviously exhausted. Right, there were powerful armies throughout all history there until the 18th century, etc. But the actual capacity, right, of the Mongols to, again, cause that scare, right, as it occurred with the expansion as far as Europe or Southeast Asia, the Near East, etc., was irreplaceable. The Mongols were, as we just said, quite logistically organized, right? The support for the armies was provided by the tribe itself, because that's what fundamentally would happen, right? These forces would move all together, and they were all invested in these mechanisms. In our other videos about Mongol warfare, we have seen how the broader income from this expedition was fundamentally meager, right? It wasn't one day, I don't know, some bored Mongol leader who decided to say, well, we have forces to spend, let's simply go conquer, this enormous chunk of Eurasia. This mechanism, as today we will not explain how it was triggered, etc., but it was still carried out by an incredibly primitive people. One may not want to exceed when we look at the Karakhitai, we look at sort of Sino-Mongol warfare throughout the centuries, and there were different layers, let's say, of sophistication, but Genghis Khan's Mongols were just per se nomads, right? They didn't quite have enormous, say, centers other than the ones that could come from this incredibly daring life of conquest, of loot, etc. And it was also an enormous question mark as far as the settlement of the various groups, because at some point, if you wanted to control, at least for a while, the, say, faraway lands, like, I don't know, the Iranian plateau, China, etc., you had to carry out a sort of colonization. You would always have this potential from the steppe that could be used to put further pressure. But fundamentally it was about substituting the elites, right, to the local ones, and you couldn't quite simply superimpose yourself, like substitute yourself to the local system. It is in part because of this self-reliance, right, on the obvious evidence that the Mongols were giving everything they had in order to challenge more advanced civilization, that paradoxically would give the rise to the belief that their armies were exceptionally large in number, right? This is obvious for the simple reason that what let's say could be mobilized in sedentary Europe on the basis of essentially a greater per capita wealth, and so a much greater pressure just to be fighting all the time. Even if we see medieval Europe as very warlike, etc., it's still, and it is very militarized, right? You know, it's been estimated that certain eras of late medieval Europe, so it was in a relatively more civilized time, had a consistently higher level of militarization intended as the actual regular participation of the local inhabitants in military operations than Frederick the Great's Prussia in the 18th century. But the Mongols were even more than this, because all they did in order to survive was essentially to fight. Right, and so whenever they found the strength, a moral one, first of all, to coalesce politically and to direct their forces against richer, softer targets, leaving, say, in fact, the more developed areas, they would achieve that, but they wouldn't have quite another system to keep things together otherwise. So we've seen this also in the video about the Western, say, sources on the reasons of the Mongol victories, that while we are told of this initial phase of despair, of this terrible monsters coming out of the steppes for punishing human sins, and the initial victories and all, realize that, first of all, it basically ended there as far as say, for Europe, for most of Europe, it's definitely evident, but also in the aforementioned systems, we see again de facto continuity with the regional systems, and the fear towards Mongols fundamentally faded away. This is also and particularly true for the Westerners that had, in my opinion, a much greater, say, an extra gear compared to other civilizations already at the time. Of course, there was an important factor in just the distance between Mongolia and Europe, but this is just a smaller one compared to the forces that eventually could have been put together had the Mongols ever even thought they could simply take over Europe as a whole. I made multiple videos on this. And again, from the same Western sources, you realize that the Mongols passed from this terrible enemy that sends hordes after horde against their enemies. At the end of the day, we're just yet another turbulent neighbor like the others existing before, and actually even asking for their support against the Muslims before at least they became Muslims themselves in the western part of Eurasia, and essentially even beginning to serve as mercenaries in Mongol armies with specialized units that were also pretty effective against the same dreaded horse archers. And we explained the trick many times, right? Being a nomadic people doesn't actually mean to be superior from a military point of view, right? There is this, we have been fed with the notion again of Attila, of Genghis Khan, and so on, these terrible figures, but in many ways we're just repeating some literary tropes, some, let's say, sources that are impressed with violence, but do not, and of course at the time they had no magic power to read in the future simply like that, but as we know, ex post, this wave, as big as it was, fundamentally just crashed itself, was not coming back, and essentially the Mongols gentrified when they set elsewhere, and Mongolia remained Mongolia, just where it was, right? But the fact of being able to mobilize an entire male population, for example, a major tribe, and seeing how the Mongols just lived in that way and saying, oh my god, if these guys move, there's going to be tons of them out there. This perception is motivated objectively by the fact that the steppes were not just Mongol in nature, and that of course there were endless, nobody really understood, at least the Pax Mongolica gave us stability. It did establish some temporary order where lots of Europeans went to China, could document what Mongolian rule really was across Eurasia, and so on, but they are telling us what essentially I'm describing here. But in fact, what they could see was just the habitual Mongolian lifestyle in the nomadic world that fundamentally had remained the same, would remain the same, and so would explain a bit better that yes, there were so many different these peoples, and that the problem is that there were many, because of course these were populated areas, depending on which, of course, and so ideally each of these warriors could pick up his things and, I don't know, marching across Eurasia for several tens of kilometers and coming to raid somewhere. The most important thing, of course, was though the political cohesion. Once the Mongol had conquered China, well, that branch remained there, and of course was extremely happy of ruling over China and consolidating on that power. The same goes for the Ilkhanate, for the Golden Horde, and with all the characteristics that those local countries had fundamentally before, and so they weren't really bothering too much. So by the late 13th, the 14th century, the great fear of the Mongol wasn't quite felt as much in the same way, if not in some fringe areas that, however, were also the most likely to, let's say, in part to be mixed even that world, especially in the Turkic area, or especially in Asia. But that also in Europe, at the end of the day, were the same ones. For example, the Rus who got rid of the Mongols in a few centuries. So again, there is no need to overly dramatize, in spite of the massive push that the Mongols managed to pull off at the beginning, and overwhelming an enormous amount of peoples and massacring a lot of them and destroying a lot of stuff and so on. Right. As we were saying before, the sort of consider this: when an army is levied, of course, it must at some point come back home. Normally, the Mongols were politically tied, as we've seen. So, for example, the aforementioned 700,000 troops with which Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, right? first of all, they are an exaggeration. Modern scholarship thinks more around 150,000, but even this, in my opinion, is unrealistic, right? When we consider that, yes, part of the civilians, if we can make this distinction, would travel, right? That some of these armies would settle in some pastures, in the steppe still, so, and in this sense normally at the outskirts of the civilized world, in order to be properly maintained as a consistent endemic element. And this wasn't happening even that frequently, telling the truth, compared to the more refined military expeditions that were in fact ever more sort of composite with certain sort of elite forces or specific ad hoc technicians, etc., drawn from quite advanced places, again, like China, like the Islamic world, and so on, for logistics, for technology, as far as especially siege warfare was concerned, because the Mongols would be quick learners in a way, but they didn't even need to develop in Mongolia on their own some sort of, I don't know, artillery capacity just per se. This was a problem that could be solved just when they were in front of the city gates of a sedentary enemy and gathering from the various tributaries some means that would automatically provide them with what was needed. So it's likely, as we will see now, that these bigger numbers that are just thrown there by a random author that, yes, was maybe reliable in the sense that in his view that number meant, oh my god, it was really a lot of them. And probably there was, but how many? And how many, especially compared to the forces, could be levied locally? It turns out that often the Mongols were actually outnumbered, right? And this is also obvious when you consider the advantage that they could gain strategically just by speed, for example, marching nearly 1,000 miles in the case of Kvaretsme, right, from their home, right, before coming to grips with the enemy in that case. And that was easier, of course, to pull off, and of course provided with other means, with other bases, right, because mainly was about finding the chain of pastures that could sustain the passage of the Mongolian army, that, as we've seen in the video about why they could have never quite conquered Europe as such, even if they had wanted to, is the fact that, yes, when the steppe ends, your supply bases really end as well, and it's quite unlikely to simply settle, at least in an area where you have to take down castle by castle in feudal reality, whereas, for example, with China was a different story, and it was a much more permeable system to some degree. But we're not here to talk about this now, right? There is yet another factor. So we've seen, first of all, this sense that, oh my god, the Mongols are all in arms, so they have so many troops, but this doesn't quite explain simply why such exaggerations in Mongol invasion. Of course, the major Mongol invasions were very big, large operations, and the Mongols were pretty good at organizing and leading them, right? That they were habituated, right, to that kind of speed and capacity to hit, loot, right, to dislocate themselves after, by the way, generations of experience considered that too, because they weren't simply marching in and winning, right? They were put in difficulty at every time. Otherwise, there would have not been a war or a battle, whatever, in the first place, right? More simply, from a literary point of view, inflated figures were easily an occasion for the victims of the Mongols to excuse their own defeat, right? If the Mongols were so many, oh my god, they were like this sea of locusts overwhelming us and whatever, they of course, your defeat would have felt somehow more justified, right? And this also pertains to a specific part of the world. The Islamic one especially was overwhelmed in a dramatic way. Baghdad was destroyed. We somehow don't picture how traumatic that thing actually was. Of course, there were many other peoples who were wiped out entirely from the face of the earth, the Mongols. But the sense at that point that, of course, it's as if somebody had destroyed Rome for real, in which there were so many sacks of Rome, but say the city was never actually destroyed by anyone. Baghdad was actually razed to the freaking ground, and if it is the capital of the caliphate, right, you must find a very good motivation, at least for this having happened. And of course, the enemies who did this, had to be monstrous in so many ways, and you couldn't quite say, as we've seen very often in the traditional mentality, say, well, they were fewer than us, right, or just like us, but they won, right? The idea is that the more they are, and this is not to say that the Arab chroniclers did this too much, at least as far as I've seen, but it's obvious that when you read, we've seen it from the videos about crusade battles, that say Western Frankish historiography was saying, maybe the enemy is 50,000 strong, Turkic armies, not radically different from the Mongol ones in outlook, especially with all those swarms of horse archers that you wouldn't even understand what the broader army, really, the core of the army list really is, right? With the dust and the continuous harassment, etc. Well, the Mongols did a pretty similar thing, and that's not quite even just an indicator of strategic and tactical superiority, because if you have that, you just smash into the enemy, right? And you use that force for good. But in that sense, the Franks could say, yes, well, I don't know, we were 8,000, the enemy was 30,000. Right, and then you have also different sources saying something different, maybe 10,000, etc. When you look at the Islamic world, the balance is like, I don't know, there were so many Franks, like, I don't know, 100,000. Right, it's not even just about the Franks, but even about the same Islamic armies. And you understand that rather than making that kind of, the enemies were too many, so we are sort of more excused for having lost. They were actually attributing some sort of idealism, sort of symbolism to the, say, number like 100,000, right? Or hyperbole, like, I don't know, after the Mongols raided, like, if I said what we found there in terms of destruction and massacre, etc., nobody would believe us, right? And so this kind of rhetoric, which belongs to that specific world and that specific historiography, when you get in tune with it, you start to understand that it's not if an Arab author for the same figure writes, I don't know, 100,000, the Frank says 10,000, it's because the Arab necessarily wants to trick anyone. It's just that the canon over which say that Islamic historiography was based, as for many other things, think about art, etc., just worked in a different way, right? And so it's not just a historian, but maybe a philologist, a linguist, an expert of literature that has to answer you why. Well, the historian can contribute, of course. I see it mostly from, in fact, these issues. The same goes, by the way, with the actual quantity of information. Western Frankish sources are very prodigal of actually critical info, right? That really makes you understand that Western literature was way more advanced than we think compared to the rest of the world already. And even just say, I don't know, a Byzantine, even though he could have been closer culturally to Hellenic historiography, as in critical and rational means surely founded the Western one more broadly, that the Byzantine was more concise, was in a sense even closer to, say, between the Franks and the Islamic world, like of course compared to the Frank that they wrote in a more similar way to the Arabs, right? So it's a complicated issue because you have to understand who wrote and why and when and how. There's a great distrust, especially in the Anglo-Saxon world, towards chroniclers, right? And instead, as a continental European military historian, I must say that we are, it's our daily bread. There can't be any medieval warfare without, by 95% without chronicles, right? It's basically all based on it. And when you start getting that sort of confidence, like sort of, again, sensitivity toward that source, you realize that they're also pretty damn reliable. Because if you reconstruct the battles, if you try to understand what happened, you realize that whoever was writing was understanding actually what was saying, was not given those numbers, for example, just as well. We don't have the records, so the chronicle must be wrong. It's unreliable. Why? Right? It's actually not the case, especially if these people were actual politicians, administrators, magistrates, officials, whatever, which, especially in the most, in fact, developed historiographical areas in Europe, that was actually the case. And it turns out, again, through statistical analysis like the ones I myself carried out at a point over thousands of quotes, that you realize there is an incredible coherence among, I don't know, tens of different sources. They were also practically non-depending on one another, right? So the same thing we said before for the defeated had to justify the disaster by claiming to have been defeated by larger numbers of enemies than the one actually were. The same Mongols actually pushed for that narrative to impress morally, emotionally, right, and thus crushing more easily their intimidated victims. And you'd say, but then what's the difference? Why wouldn't, say, switch roles in that regard? Well, why wouldn't the other side do the same? Well, in part they would even do that. The problem is that it was the Mongols who was taking them over, right? So the Mongols actually won. And you can't at that point make it. That's the actual and only discriminant. The rest is just rhetoric, right? And if the Mongols were to say, oh my God, we can't make these guys know that we're so many, and so that everybody will flee before we even arrive, well, the better, right? But you need to have eventually the effective numbers for, of course, it's not that everybody literally fled in front of them, but they, in order to eventually overwhelm the resistance that would always remain, especially in a sedentary context, where again it's not that it's easier to overwhelm the steppes, but once you have at least accomplished what Genghis Khan did at the beginning, that's the major deal. Well, you can at that point have an upper hand on the steppes, and the Mongols definitely affect that a lot. Right. Again, I made really lots of videos on steppes warfare. We'll come back on them at some other point. If the enemy believed that resistance was hopeless for whatever reason, they would be more inclined to surrender. It's that simple. And the Mongols could afford that because they just were a hell of an army. Right. And don't get me wrong, Mongol numbers were actually large, right? They didn't invade, I don't know, regions just with, I don't know, few thousand cavalry. And that was definitely not the case. There is another factor in thinking of the fact that the Mongols traveled with, as you know, a very large amount of animals, of horses specifically. I made a video specifically on this, by the way, that dramatically inflate. If you counted just the horse as a horseman, which was not the case because a single horseman could have really many horses even with him, on average something between few and some, right? But overall, they could even have 8, 10 horses, right? And this was for their particular way of war, and it was maybe fueling, of course, that impression, even though such major expeditions were also more, let's say, channeled in logistically, because just moving those masses of horses basically prevented you, for example, to move in summer and outside of a major regional waterway, right? So the Mongols, again, were pushed by a dramatic moral force. It's very difficult to read their mind in terms of personal ambitions of the average guy who went there, and etc. But it's obvious that conquering land out of Mongolia, mostly in the center society, was very important to them, because it was much better than wherever they came from. Without mentioning that, when we look at steppes armies, there is always an enormous deal of troops that join without being actually drilled into the army. This is surely another factor that contributed to the inflated numbers. We have seen this regularly, often, even in Europe, right? The steppes are close, and so if anyone knows, as it always happens, months in advance at least, that there is going to be a major campaign, you can easily cross thousands of kilometers just to come loot, because you know that this army is going to smash a lot, and there is a lot of plunder, and this contributes, right, to the, so your presence there is, of course, first of all, supported towards the role of the army, for its supplies, for scouting, for whatever. And these troops were relatively cheap, right? The Mongol elite, also a substantial core of their force, was also of some important numerical strength, was well drilled, equipped, armed, motivated, etc. But there were also, say, the majority of troops was normally lighter horsemen, almost without any defensive outfit, that was simply joining for loot, and was not even meant to come into close combat, at least against heavier troops, right? And so, again, the steppes warfare is very, very logical in many ways. So, the proportion of the men fighting, as we've seen, within their society was a very important thing, right? You couldn't have the same percentage of mobilized population in a sedentary world. And this also tells you how advantaged the sedentary world really was, because it was lazier or spoiled, right? And at some point, of course, this was enough, depending on the circumstances, to tip the balance in favor of the Mongols, but not, say, on the longer run, to simply turn that into another Mongolia. Also, the lazier, the richer, and so it means that actually you do have hell of means to keep the same Mongols out. And it's not a surprise, say, in Europe, that more or less when wealth begins, the Mongols stop, and or at least realize that they had already pushed far enough, because they could even devastate one country but not actually occupying it. That's the case with Poland, with Hungary, even the Rus telling the truth, because it was, say, with the word of the steppe, again, is are the oil fields of the Mongol armies, and the Mongol horseman is not that keen to get lost in a forest, being taken down by local woodsmen, right? They're just not designed to fight like that. They're designed for something much bigger, that is to say, to exploit this major longitudinally developing steppe area, to go very fast back and forth with very drilled, motivated armies to catch the enemies unprepared and smashing where you realize that there is a weakness, right, and that you can exploit. So that when we get to the actual battlefield, we can say that the impression of invariably huge numbers was often illusory. Right, consider that we barely have at this point any information historically from actual fighters from both sides. Chroniclers, other figures were learned people living mostly in cities that dedicated. Maybe they also had fought themselves, but they weren't the hardcore, especially during the 13th century, that properly feudal world. It's what a 13th century knight in Europe thought is largely unknown in terms of and even when they did, as the Minnesänger, etc., but they did that in a stylistic way, for which they were literally not interested. I mean, they lived their own life, their own world. Everybody knew what that was, even if they didn't write it down, because we would read it anyway, right? Aside from oral tradition. But if you were a knight, if you were already privileged by that to be invested in issues that were known in the courts among the elite, and that was enough. They would know about you. It was important to have children, to pass your own property down, all this kind of stuff, and just making your house more powerful. That was really the objective. So you couldn't quite have much of an info, right? And even when you have these guys writing, you realize that they didn't care to write about such encounters. They weren't, especially with the Mongols, that frequent, telling the truth. Or even if they became later with systems like the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, we see it was nothing really special. And nothing really that different from what had existed before and would exist even later, right? And the sanitary world remained a sanitary world. In 1211, Genghis Khan, during his campaign against the Jin dynasty of China, is said to have brought with him 110,000 men. Right? Now, this number may be exaggerated only if we... there is one chance for these big numbers to be true. That is to say, when you have, in fact, these major invasions, and you have actually different countries even within the same Mongol Confederacy moving separately, right? You wouldn't like to have all these troops staffed, concentrated in a single place, unless, like, getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen, something like that, linking up at last. And this was practiced even by smaller armies, by the way, for obvious needs, and especially with all those horses that create enormous hygienic problems logistically. So that is a thing. But the important aspect of this is that even if these troops had been concentrated in a single place and not sent in different columns, then China could count, at least on paper, more than 4 times the numbers that the Mongols had mobilized. And sometimes we just have these quantities without knowing how many troops were mobilized and actually fielded instead, and what does it mean, for example, to rule China, of course, having to maintain important reserves into key provinces, at least, in order for deterrence and so on. So everything is, it's not just about the fact that it's not documented, but it's about the fact that it depends on politics and on moral factors that you cannot quite calculate just per se, right? And sources, and that's why I was saying before that interpreting what they actually mean by these quantities, I think, are what we should comparatively observe. For example, for the I think this was the first invasion of Japan, the Mongols put together allegedly 600 warships, right? Were at least ordered from southern China, plus 900 from Korea. And interestingly enough, the supposed number of troops eventually to be used for the invasion were 40,000 but from Korea, and 100,000 from southern China. Now the here I will not say talk about the difference between Korean and Chinese naval warfare, but you already have by quantity and by this in fact evident the disproportion, say, between the troops and the ships, right, from the two respective routes of invasion. Of course, an important datum, it's not just between the 40,000 and 100,000. Maybe they were just, I don't know, 15,000 and 30,000, right? And here we have always to consider, were they fighting force or talking aids, field aids, or here what's what, right? And very often these are the only informations we will stick to. There is not much else really to wrap your mind around, except if you actually get into the depths of political detail, where you realize also by experience, say, I don't know, given the history, the military history of southern China or Korea, saying, you know, how realistic is this, on which basis. Of course you find lots of other info, but it's just comparative one. It's just like saying, well, let's surround them a bit on the basis of this fact or this other, but you don't actually have the full-fledged, laid out figure that you really need to be sure that that's going to be the number. As we remembered before, and it's notorious, the Mongol armies were based on a decimal system. Marco Polo records the largest unit as being the famous Stug, right, of allegedly 100,000 men, right? Marco Polo had, of course, traveled across Eurasia, but he was likely referring to the, say, organic potential here of the quite multicultural armies of Mongol China. Was, as we've seen, the place where, when the Mongols took over, of course, they could simply find plenty of manpower, right? And here, let's not comment on the quality of it and the important implications for also the type of operations, because, of course, the Mongols could not fight in China simply the same way they had been fighting elsewhere, at least. In let's say the individual Mongolian warrior would have preferred to keep on fighting his own style, but as far as the organization of larger units, you can imagine things being, especially the Mongol element, being numerically much diluted compared to the Chinese one. Then there was the two men of 10,000 men. These are somehow notorious. The latter consisted of 10 Mingans of 1,000 men. And interestingly enough, we find in the early 13th century, when they were first created, or we know for the first time of 95 of these Mingans, which, given the decimal system there, as we've seen, 10 of them made a two-man, and 10 two-men made a tug, right? The thing adds up, right? 95 Mingans would have been almost 100, that would have been the tug, right? This 95 would theoretically give 95,000 men. We're speaking theory here, now I explain the thing. Albeit, only 90 names of commanders of this Mingans are listed, which may make us think that perhaps there were actually less than these, and especially that they were actually not at full strength. This is always the case, especially on campaign. You may have districts, tribes, etc. that are actually made up, especially for, as we've seen, the Mongols to live in the steppes, by the actual people that live there, so you know more or less how much manpower you have. Now, being able to mobilize them entirely is a different thing, but especially when campaign starts, of course, numbers go significantly down. And so, as I was saying at the very beginning, you can't even think it was a true full standardization of the Mongolian organic, just per se. If you go down the line, you see Ishmingan, also called Araza, or sometimes a Guran, right? Consider the semantics here, which is what we're not going to go in depth in, but again, yes, we are told, like for other medieval armies, that it was this unit, but we know of that not all the time. We don't actually have the list, or the, if you're lucky, you have that historian that says, look, that type of unit, which I call in this way and somebody else called in one another, right? So it's like, I don't know, Polybius Samaia and Roman cohortes, right? What does that actually mean? Well, that's an equivalence, by the way, but we get just a few of that. We must find the correspondence, and we're not even sure what happened in between. So, of course, Mongolian history lasts considerably, but it especially stretches over a vast amount of territory, to say the least. So imagine all the instances of all the varieties, all the sort of modifications, all the various languages that documented at the same time, and so on. So I will make a video actually about the Mongolian army organization as such, which we still haven't done today. We just talk about this anecdotally to give an idea of the scale of the figures. Like we find the other subunit is the Yagun of 100 men. Each Yagun, or 10 arbands, is 10 men. Then this you get to some sort of contubernium, right, in legionary terms, etc. Right. So for the smaller figures now it's useless to comment further, but consider that these forces were still at least considered to be all part of the same of a same tactical unit. So you must understand what this was about concretely, more or less also what were the proportions. There is an Ilkhanid vizier as much as historian, Rashid al-Din, quite interesting figure, thus an Arab that worked for the Mongols. We have seen it, by the way, in our recent video about the Burmese warfare, the Mongol invasion of Burma, when you see an actual commander of these in an Arab in charge, right? Rashid al-Din wrote around 1306. We are in relatively later times, but he talks about the Mongolian army on the death of Genghis Khan in 1227. So after a life of conquest, by the way. So if you talk about the 12th century, etc., it's even more complicated. But and this is at the height of at least, you know, when the empire was already substantially large. And according to Rashid al-Din, the Mongols had altogether in the army 129,000 men that were subdivided in on this basis. The Yungar, the army of the left wing or the east, counting 62,000. The Barangar, the army of the right wing or the west, of 38,000. The Kol, army of the center, the imperial orders, which counted 1,000 picked men, 4,000 guards for each of the princes, Yuchi, Yagatai, Ogodai. This served in turn for the backbone of their own, say, multicultural armies race, right? The other forces would be agglutinated as detachment when they entered a conquered land for levying other troops from there. Plus, you have 16,000 guards for other members of the imperial family. Now, as you understand, these latter are sort of armies within armies. When we talk here about the right, left wing with the cardinal points, it refers not to, say, what would have been factually used in a major battle, because the Mongolian army couldn't be brought all together just in one single place. Yes, back at home there was the Kurultai, all the Mongols had to come back to elect their new leader. But as you understand here, the left wing, first of all, it's as if the Mongols were looking from north to south in this order. The left wing is on the east and is basically almost double. The right one, it's counting just like alone almost a half of the entire army, which means actually that they need to move against China, and these actual wings were actually also the district in which the Mongolian earthland was subdivided. It could provide them. Plus, this sort of ultra super cocky elite, right, that really reflects the norm in steppes warfare as far as the idea of a central clan, house, right, tribe that has the rules over the others, the Kingizid one in this case, and that has thus the heaviest troops, right? Of course, as we were just saying, these are tactically complete armies on their own, so you have the ultra elite that is also a numerical one in this sense, and lots of horse archers. But it was important in some Mongolian armies to have, this is a trend that you see also in Europe in the same years, especially during the 13th, at the beginning of 14th century, before the big crisis of the mid-14th, that the need to have sort of men-at-arms that fight with squires, together with squires that are basically at this point just like them in terms of heaviness of equipment, seems to have been considerable in the steppes as well. Right, in Western Europe you start seeing basically just heavy cavalry and basically ever less lighter one, if not later on. In the steppes, you can't quite cancel the fact that, as we've seen, the majority of people lives out there as warriors, right? But it's obvious that if now you start ruling over other countries and you have this transcontinental empire, etc., you can provide to the elite much heavier, better equipment. You can select these troops better, and so you can have even ratios of, I don't know, 1 man-at-arm per horse archer in this guard. This makes a lot of sense because it's also the way through which the deterrent through which the imperial family could maintain control of the entire Mongolian tribes at home. And this geographical distribution, as we've seen in the center, of course, is a precaution, not just from possible invasions, which at that point from another people seemed to be really unlikely, because we would even like to go in the steppes, by the way, even if they wanted, they could, but also because they could equally threaten them in a way. Of course, we will see this distribution better also on a map at some point, because well, it can give a better idea, even though the proportions are sort of varying. This is just Rashid al-Din, by the way, telling that, right, after almost a century for a people that was not even his own. And at the death of Genghis Khan, so things change, right? We have a variant copy of the same Rashid al-Din that gives us a total of 230,000. So what happened here? Well, basically, the guy who read Rashid al-Din decided that it was better to almost double the number, right? And it gives the Jungar, so the army of the left wing or east, at 52,000. The Barangar, the army of the right wing or west, at 47,000. The Kol, so-called Kol, of 101,000 Imperial Guard, with the 1,000, 4,000 for each of the three princes, and 17 guards for the remainder of the family. This is clearly one of the most typical ways some medieval authors, especially in this cultural area, tended to leave, sometimes literally the impression as a historian is that they wanted to leave their fingerprint on these numbers. They wanted to say that their story was somehow better, right? That if they changed a number, they were proper. This is something especially I found in some Renaissance stories from, say, the 16th century, using sources of the 14th century. And you realize that even though sometimes these guys had sources from the same 14th century that we don't have anymore, that just from the type of information that very often copies the entire text to the letter, these numbers changing there have basically nothing to do with any greater, deeper knowledge of that historical event, and especially when the pattern is repeated. And so here, doubling the number, re-equilibrating the Imperial Guard, saying 16,000 guards for the rest of the family, 17 instead of 16,000, was the way for this guy of rewriting the version of Rashid al-Din. And we don't know why, specifically. Again, sometimes it's even senseless. Like, I studied battles of the 14th century, fine. Again, the guy writing at the time that says, I don't know, there were 400 men-at-arms that went to that place, and in another case 600, and you find the later source in humanistic times that changes that from 5,000 to 5,000. It adds simply 100 to say, well, okay, this is me saying it, right? And sometimes it's, again, difficult to see why they did that, because it's obvious that the author accidentally didn't quite make the mistake of counting 100 men less for giving that news. And by the way, we also know pretty evidently that while the 14th century source in that sense is largely original, the 15th century one is just repeating the 14th one, right? Philologically, but altering that. So I think this was a good example of how trivial and banal sometimes certain numbers are, if you take them not just to the number, in fact, but also if you don't consider the where the information is taken and what it means in that specific time and place. Sometimes you can have copying mistakes. Sometimes you can actually have, better knowledge on that, or you may think to have one. So this is how it depends. But it's not that arbitrary, at least for us to sort of look at the thing in a satisfactory fashion. The Mongols are recorded at some point by the same Rashid al-Din to be able to muster as many as 1,400,000 men. So what does this mean, right? Khan Ogodai 1241 is claimed to have maintained 5 armies totaling 1,500,000 men. And if they are to be taken seriously, such figures must represent levies of vast numbers of subject peoples and auxiliaries. So when you hear about this enormous human tide, right, emerging from the steppes, it's not quite actually just the Mongols, right? It's not even actually an army emerging from the steppes like that. It's just an assessment depending on which is the base you're taking in consideration. Also considering that the Mongols at some point again were importantly divided, and this had quite an important aspect right in it. The the truth being just a theoretical manpower. How many troops were there in China? How many levies on paper? Just peasants, right? Levied on a rota system and actually maybe counted in this sense as a wall, but obviously could have never been levied, right? If not to cause a mess, right? It's an economical collapse and beyond, right? So this is quite important to assess, I would say, as it's not simple as that. And I would say this speaks briefly of the various causes of what size the Mongol armies could or couldn't be. And then every battle is different, every reality is different. We already discussed some battles in Mongol warfare here and there. Never actually made a video about a battle in which the Mongols were involved precisely, but there is still a specific situation, case by case, that can be modified in this regard. We will hopefully see it in the future. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.